My daughter-in-law stood in the middle of my living room, hands on her hips, chin tilted upward, as if she already owned the place. Her words were sharp, clean, like a blade. "You're too old for this villa. My husband and I are moving in next week. You should start packing." For a moment, the world went quiet. No sound. No air. Just her voice echoing off the walls I built with my own hands 42 years ago. I stared at her, not because I didn't understand what she'd said, but because I couldn't quite believe she'd said it. In my house. The villa around us wasn't just a roof and four walls. Every brick carried a piece of my life. I laid the foundation myself the year my wife and I got married. I carved our initials into one of the beams before the plaster went up. My son took his first steps right there, near the fireplace she was now leaning against like a queen claiming a throne. My wife laughed here, cooked here, cried here, dreamed here. And after she was gone, this villa was the one thing I still had left that felt like home. And now, she wanted me gone. The worst part wasn't even her words. It was my son, my only son, standing behind her. Silent. Eyes down. Like a stranger in my house. The same house he'd grown up in. I felt something inside me tighten, not just anger. Something colder. Heavier. It wasn't the first disrespect, but it was the loudest. She thought I was weak. Old. Powerless. She looked at me like I was just, in her way. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I let the silence do the talking. Because in that silence, something shifted. And she had no idea what she had just awakened. But before I tell you what happened next, if you love powerful, emotional stories about family and justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that this villa wasn't just a house. It was my life's foundation. And I don't let anyone tear down what I built. I was 26 years old when I first set foot on the empty plot of land that would one day become this villa. Back then, it was just bare soil, scattered rocks, and my dreams. I remember standing there with a tape measure, a pencil behind my ear, and my wife laughing at me because I wouldn't stop talking about where the kitchen window would be, how the light would hit the living room in the mornings, and how our children would grow up running barefoot on the marble floors I planned to lay with my own two hands. And I did. Every corner of this place carries my fingerprints. I didn't just buy this house. I built it. From the ground up. Brick by brick. We raised our only child, my son, here. I watched him take his first steps on the cold tiles of the hallway. I still remember how his little hands smudged the freshly painted walls, how his laughter filled the garden in summer evenings, how we sat by the fireplace on stormy nights telling him stories to keep the thunder away. Those weren't just memories. Those were foundations. Then, 10 years ago, my wife passed away. Cancer. I held her hand in the same bedroom she once decorated herself, promising her I'd protect what we built together. That promise became my anchor. I kept the villa exactly how she left it, her favorite curtains still hang in the living room. Her rose garden still blooms every spring. My son grew up, of course. Went abroad to study, built his own life. I gave him everything I had to make sure he had a future. I sacrificed sleep, comfort, even my own retirement. I wanted him to have everything I didn't. And when he brought home the woman who would become his wife, I opened my door with both hands. At first, she was polite. Kind even. She complimented the house, my cooking, my stories. She laughed at my jokes at the dinner table. I believed she respected me. I believed she understood that this villa wasn't just property, it was my wife's soul preserved in brick and plaster. But slowly, things started to shift. She began making small suggestions. Why don't you modernize the kitchen? It looks so old. Do you really need all these rooms to yourself? It would be so much easier if we just lived here. You shouldn't be alone at your age. I brushed it off. I told myself she was just trying to help. But beneath those soft words was something sharper, a sense of entitlement she didn't bother hiding for long. My son, blinded by love or perhaps too weak to confront her, began repeating her words as if they were his own. I started noticing how they looked at the villa, not with reverence, but with calculation. As if they were already measuring where their furniture would go. As if my home was just an asset waiting to be claimed. And each time she spoke, she used the same phrase. At your age. Like my age stripped me of my worth. Like the years that built this house made me less. That villa wasn't just 4 walls. It was 42 years of love, of sacrifice, of legacy. Every nail, every tile, every inch of wood held a piece of my story. And now the woman who married my son stood there, smiling sweetly, plotting to take it away. I didn't say anything when I saw the glances between them. I didn't argue when she dropped hints about moving in. But I was listening. Watching. Because family betrayal doesn't always begin with screaming. Sometimes, it starts with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. And I knew then, long before her cruel words in the living room, that this was coming. She'd already set her eyes on my home. But what she didn't know was, she wasn't the only one preparing. I was, too. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The sun poured in through the wide arched windows, washing the living room in warm gold. A house I built with my hands, now filled with tension I didn't ask for. She arrived without calling first, my daughter-in-law, heels clicking across the marble floor like she owned the place. My son followed a few steps behind her, head down, hands stuffed into his pockets. That was the first sign. He always used to greet me with a smile when he came home. But that day, he didn't even look me in the eye. She didn't sit. She positioned herself in the center of the room, like a queen making a declaration. Her voice carried the kind of confidence that comes only from someone who's already decided the outcome. Let's not make this difficult, she began. It's time to make practical decisions. You're too old to be rattling around in this big place by yourself. It makes no sense. I watched her carefully. Her tone wasn't concerned. It was final. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a stack of papers, placing them on the coffee table like a lawyer serving eviction notices. We've spoken to a real estate agent, she said smoothly. This villa is worth a fortune. If we sell it, we can invest the money smartly. Or, she paused, as if savoring the next part, we can just move in. You can relocate to a smaller apartment, somewhere comfortable. It's a win-win. Win-win. She used those words like a weapon. I glanced at my son, hoping, foolishly, that he would step in, say something, remind her whose house this was. But he stood there, silent, shoulders stiff. His silence hurt more than her arrogance. She kept talking, like she was outlining a business deal. We already spoke to a contractor. We'll renovate everything, this place is stuck in the 80s. It's time it had a fresh start. Her words struck like a hammer. This wasn't a conversation. It was a takeover. Then, as if twisting the knife, she said, and don't worry, we'll make sure you're taken care of. A small flat. Maybe by the sea. It'll be perfect for someone your age. Someone your age. The way she said it, like my existence was a burden. Like I was old furniture being moved out to make space for something new. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I simply let her speak. Because sometimes, silence is louder than a scream. She mistook that silence for surrender. I saw it in the way her lips curved upward into a small, victorious smirk. She truly thought she'd won. Then she did something that burned into my memory. She turned around, scanned the living room like an interior designer sizing up a project, and said to my son, we'll get rid of this old furniture. Everything will be fresh. Modern. This wasn't just a house to me. This was my wife's handwriting on the walls. The furniture she picked. The clock she loved. The smell of her roses still lingering near the open windows. And now this woman was planning to erase it all like it never existed. For a brief moment, the humiliation was overwhelming. She stood there in my home, planning my erasure. And my son, my own flesh and blood, just let her. Then came the final blow. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to something almost sweet, and said, "We've already decided, Papa. We're moving in next week. I think it's time you start packing." The words echoed in my head long after she said them. The villa, once a sanctuary, felt suddenly small. The air heavy. And then, as they turned to leave, I caught the look she gave me, a look of pure certainty. She didn't see me as a man. She saw me as an obstacle. A weak-old man who'd soon be out of her way. I stood alone in the living room for a long time after they left. The late afternoon light spilled across the tiled floor. I could almost hear my wife's voice in that silence. And in that stillness, the sting of humiliation began to harden into something else. Something colder. Stronger. She thought she had taken everything from me that day. But what she didn't know, was that I had been building more than a house all those years. I had been building power. And the day she tried to take my home was the day she'd learn just how much of it I still held. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I walked from room to room, barefoot on the cold floor, letting my hands brush against the walls, the furniture, the doors. These weren't just objects, they were my history carved into wood and stone. The villa smelled faintly of roses from the garden out back. My late wife's roses. She planted them herself 38 years ago. Even after she was gone, they bloomed every spring. I knelt down beside the window, looking at the moonlight spilling across the petals. And I whispered, "They think I'm too old to fight. But they've forgotten who built this place." She had always called me stubborn, back when we were young. Not in a cruel way. In a way that meant she knew I didn't back down easily. And she was right. I wasn't going to beg to keep the house I built with my hands. As I sat in that silence, humiliation slowly turned into something sharper, resolve. If they wanted to take my home, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. I opened the old safe in the study. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years, the original deed, my late wife's will, and the living trust agreement I had set up quietly more than 2 decades ago. I had done it then to protect her and our son if anything ever happened to me. But in doing so, I had also protected something far more powerful, ownership. Every signature. Every notarized stamp. Every line of legal text confirmed what she clearly didn't know: this villa wasn't some family property floating in limbo. It was mine. Legally. Irrevocably. And it was locked in a way no greedy hand could easily undo. I sat down at my desk and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It belonged to a friend of mine, Mr. Emmanuel, a lawyer I'd worked with back in my active days. A sharp man. One of the few people I trusted completely. "Joe," he said when he picked up. His voice was warm, steady. "It's been a long time." "Yes," I said calmly. "But I think I might need your help." He listened quietly as I explained everything, every word my daughter-in-law had thrown at me, every inch of the arrogance she'd worn like perfume. By the end of the call, his voice had hardened. "She has no legal ground to stand on," he said firmly. "And if they're already making moves behind your back, we'll make sure they walk into their own trap." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time that night, I felt a spark of power return to me. But this wasn't just going to be about paperwork. She had humiliated me in my own home, in front of my son. She had stripped my dignity with her smile. And if I was going to respond, it wouldn't be with raised voices or petty fights. It would be with precision. Over the next few days, I started moving quietly. I gathered every document I owned on the villa: purchase agreements, renovation permits, trust documents, tax filings. Emmanuel reviewed them line by line. He tightened what needed tightening, updated what needed updating. By the end of the week, the legal protections around this property were like steel walls. But I didn't stop there. I also contacted a handful of people I hadn't spoken to in years. People who had once worked for me, learned from me, grown under this roof. Architects. Contractors. Old friends. People who respected me not for my age, but for the life I'd lived. Something's happening, I told them. And I may need you soon. None of them asked why. None of them hesitated. One simply said, "You say when." That was the thing my daughter-in-law didn't understand. She saw an old man alone in a big house. She didn't see the decades of loyalty, of connections built not through greed but through kindness. She didn't see the people who still carried my name in their hearts. She underestimated me. And that was her mistake. On the third night, I returned to my wife's garden. The air was cool, the roses swaying gently. I placed my hand on the wooden railing of the veranda and made myself a promise. I won't let her take this from me. Not this house. Not this legacy. Not my dignity. And as the moonlight washed over the villa, I knew exactly what needed to be done. She had drawn the battle line when she told me to pack my things. But I'd spent a lifetime preparing for storms. This was going to be the fight she never saw coming. 3 days after that night in the rose garden, I made the call. Just one. But that one call was all it took to set everything in motion. You see, what my daughter-in-law didn't understand was that this villa wasn't just where I lived, it was the center of a life I had built for decades. A life that touched hundreds of people. While she saw an old man in a house too big for him, what she couldn't see was the network of hands, hearts, and loyalty that had grown quietly around me all these years. The first person I called was Charles. He was just 16 when I gave him his first job as an apprentice on one of my early construction projects. He's a renowned architect now. When I told him what happened, he didn't hesitate. "Sir," he said, voice firm, "just tell me when to show up." Then I called Mira, one of my late wife's former students. Back then, she used to come here every evening, struggling to pass her exams. My wife tutored her for free. Today she's a lawyer, and one of the sharpest legal minds in the state. She didn't ask why I was calling after so long. She only said, "I owe your family everything. Whatever you need, I'm in." And that's how it went. One call became two. Two became five. And by nightfall, my quiet little house, the one they thought was occupied by a lonely old man, had woken up an entire army of people who remembered what this place meant. The next morning, my lawyer friend Emmanuel came over. I laid the stack of property documents on the table. He spread them out carefully, checking every line. He nodded. "Joe, legally, you're untouchable. But if they try to make a mess publicly, we can make it much messier for them." That was all I needed to hear. Over the next several days, preparations happened quietly but deliberately. Emmanuel and Mira worked together to finalize additional protections on the trust and the property title, layers that made the villa legally impenetrable. They even prepared a restraining order draft, just in case things escalated beyond words. Meanwhile, Charles and a few other people from my past began making arrangements. I didn't tell them to confront anyone. I didn't need noise. I needed presence. A wall of silent strength. What my daughter-in-law didn't know was that she had picked the wrong kind of man to corner. She had mistaken silence for weakness. But silence, in the hands of someone who has lived long and seen much, can be the loudest weapon of all. Late one evening, Charles called. "We're ready, sir. If she shows up, she won't just see you standing there." I thanked him quietly. My heart was steady. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what was mine without ever raising my voice. Meanwhile, my son had grown strangely distant. He barely called, and when he did, his words were careful, practiced, like a man caught between loyalty and cowardice. I didn't pressure him. I'd already learned that silence reveals more than confrontation ever does. The night before everything unfolded, I sat on the veranda again, staring at the lights glowing softly through the villa's windows. I could almost see my wife's reflection in the glass, smiling the way she always did when she believed in me. "They think they're moving in," I whispered into the night. "But they've already walked into something far bigger than they realize." The following morning, Emmanuel arrived early. Mira followed, her hair tied back, a folder tucked under her arm. Then Charles, along with others. Old friends, ments, people whose lives were stitched into the fabric of this home. One by one, they stood in my garden, drinking coffee like a quiet storm gathering strength. By noon, the driveway was full. Cars lined up neatly along the street. Not a protest. Not a mob. Just presence. Strong, calm, undeniable. "Joe," Emmanuel said, resting a hand on my shoulder, "she has no idea what's waiting for her." And he was right. She didn't. The moment came later that afternoon. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the sound of heels clicking on the tiled path outside. Her. And, of course, my son trailing behind her like a shadow. I didn't rush to meet them. I wanted her to walk in and see everything for herself. When she opened the door, she froze. Her eyes darted from the row of unfamiliar cars in the driveway to the dozen faces she didn't recognize, lawyers, architects, old friends. Every single one of them standing or sitting calmly, like they belonged here. Because in a way, they did. She stepped inside, trying to mask the flicker of uncertainty on her face. She straightened her blouse, lifted her chin, and forced that same condescending smile she wore the day she told me to pack. "What's going on here?" she asked sharply. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Emmanuel stepped forward, folder in hand, followed by Mira. They looked professional. Prepared. She didn't even realize the room she thought was hers had turned into a fortress she couldn't penetrate. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not to yell. Not to humiliate. But to show her, quietly, firmly, that this wasn't a battle she could win. I looked at her, then at my son. He avoided my eyes. She tried to smile again, but it was trembling now. She thought I was just an old man standing alone in a house. What she saw that day was the weight of a lifetime, standing right behind me. And it had only just begun. She walked into my living room like it was already hers. Head high. Arms folded. That same arrogant glint in her eyes. The same one she wore the day she told me to start packing. But what she didn't expect, was to walk into a room already full. The villa was alive that afternoon. The faint hum of quiet conversations filled the air. My people, old friends, ments, my lawyer, my wife's former students, sat calmly in the living room and the garden. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was steady. Unshakable. Her heels clicked against the marble tiles as she looked around, her mouth parting just slightly. Confusion flickered in her eyes. This wasn't part of her plan. "Joe," she said finally, her voice sharp and a little uneasy. "What is this?" I didn't answer. I stayed seated in my favorite chair, the one I built myself 30 years ago, my back straight, hands resting on the armrests. She was used to seeing me quiet and tired. But this time, I wasn't quiet. I was still. There's a difference. Emmanuel, my lawyer, stood to my right. Mira, my late wife's protégé, stood to my left. Charles leaned against the doorframe with a calm smile. Behind them, every face in that room was someone who had known this villa longer than she had known my son. People who had grown up respecting me, not fearing me, but respecting me. My son stepped in behind her, eyes darting nervously around the room. He wasn't expecting this either. His hands fidgeted, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty etched clearly across his face. She tried to recover quickly. "This is still your house, Joe," she said, smiling tightly. "But you know it's too big for you. We just want what's best for everyone." "Everyone," I repeated slowly, my voice carrying through the room. "Or just you?" Her jaw tightened at that. I nodded at Emmanuel. He stepped forward, calm and composed, opening the folder in his hand. "Ma'am," he began, his tone clipped, "before this conversation goes any further, you should be aware that this property is fully owned by Mr. Joe. It has been in his legal possession for over 4 decades. Additionally, the villa is protected under a living trust, meaning it cannot be transferred, sold, or occupied without his explicit consent." Her smile faltered. "That doesn't change the fact that—" "Actually," Mira cut in smoothly, "it changes everything." She turned to look at Mira, probably expecting a meek assistant. She didn't realize she was facing one of the top attorneys in the state. "This trust is airtight," Mira continued. "Any attempt to claim or alter ownership without Mr. Joe's consent would be considered fraud. And any forced removal attempt could result in criminal charges." The silence in the room was deafening. My son swallowed hard. She shifted uncomfortably, but she still wasn't ready to let go of her arrogance. "Look," she said, taking a small step forward, "I'm just trying to make sure this villa doesn't go to waste. He's too old to be taking care of it on his own. I mean, look at him." I didn't flinch. Emmanuel didn't either. "But Charles." Charles laughed quietly. Not mockingly. The kind of laugh that tells a person they've just said something deeply stupid. I finally stood up. Slowly. And as I did, the room fell silent. She hadn't seen me like this before. Not standing tall. Not with dozens of eyes behind me, steady as stone. She'd only ever seen me as the quiet old man who let her talk. But that day, I didn't let her do anything. "You told me to pack my things," I said, my voice low but clear. "You told me I was too old for this house. You stood here, in this room, and talked about where you'd put your furniture. You laughed like my years meant nothing." She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "You saw an old man," I continued. "But what you didn't see was everything behind him. 42 years of my blood in these walls. A lifetime of people whose lives were built right here. This isn't just a house. It's my legacy. And I don't hand that over to someone who looks at me like I'm in the way." Her face flushed. She glanced at my son, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Because even he knew this wasn't a fight she could win. Mira laid a single document on the coffee table. "This is a formal notice," she said. "Any further attempts to pressure or coerce Mr. Joe into vacating his home will result in immediate legal action. And considering the people in this room, you won't just lose a fight. You'll lose everything." She stared at the paper like it was a weapon. And in a way, it was. Outside, more cars had arrived. Old students, neighbors, friends who'd heard about the situation. The street was lined. Not with noise. With witnesses. She had brought her entitlement to my doorstep. I had brought the world that loved me to mine. "Who are all these people?" she asked finally, voice shaking now. I looked at her squarely. "These," I said softly, "are the people who remember who I really am. The people who owe me nothing, but showed up anyway. You thought I was alone. You thought I was weak. But you were wrong." She opened her mouth again, but the words stumbled. Because there was nothing left to say. She wasn't standing in front of a lonely old man anymore. She was standing in front of a wall she couldn't move. My son finally spoke then. Quietly. "Honey, maybe we should go." For the first time, she didn't argue. She picked up her purse, her face pale, her arrogance cracked wide open. She turned and walked toward the door, shoulders stiff, her steps faster than they were when she came in. My son followed, hesitant, head lowered, as if finally realizing just how far this had gone. As the door closed behind them, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then Charles clapped me gently on the shoulder. "That," he said with a grin, "was beautiful." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I looked around at the people standing in my living room, the very people who had seen my best and worst years. They didn't just defend my house. They defended what it stood for. I walked to the window and glanced out at the driveway. The villa glowed softly in the late afternoon sun, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a place under siege. It felt like home again. She thought she could corner me. But I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to throw her out. I just needed to remind her, and my son, whose ground they were standing on. And that reminder had been loud enough. The house was quiet again. But this time, it was the kind of quiet that belongs to me. They left that afternoon with their heads down, she, trembling with humiliation she tried to hide behind clenched jaws, and my son, caught in the storm he'd let her build. The moment the door shut behind them, the air in the villa felt lighter, cleaner. For weeks it had carried the weight of tension, betrayal, and arrogance. But now, it felt like the home it was always meant to be. Still, battles like this don't end with a single confrontation. The echo of what happened that day traveled fast. By evening, my sister called. Then an old neighbor. Then a cousin. Everyone had heard something. My son and his wife had spent months quietly planting seeds, whispering to relatives that I was too old to live alone, that it would be better if they took over the villa. But after what happened, the story changed. The people they thought they could manipulate now saw the truth. 2 days later, my son came back alone. No expensive perfume trailing behind him this time. No sharp footsteps of hers announcing their arrival. Just him, standing at the gate like a boy again. When I opened the door, he didn't speak right away. He stared at the ground, hands shoved deep in his pockets, a posture I hadn't seen since he was a teenager who'd done something wrong and didn't know how to face me. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside. He walked into the living room. The same room he'd stood in silently while his wife spoke to me like a stranger. He lowered himself onto the couch, elbows on his knees, head down. "I messed up," he said finally. His voice cracked a little. "I should have said something that day. I should have stood up for you." I didn't answer right away. I just watched him. He kept talking, his words spilling out like a dam finally cracking. "She said it was for the best. She said I was doing the right thing. And I believed her. I let her make me think this house was just walls. Just property. But it's not." He finally looked up at me then, and his eyes were red. "I know what this house means. I grew up here. I was supposed to protect it with you, not take it from you." I let out a slow breath. "You didn't just let her speak for you, son. You let her speak over me in my own home." He flinched. But he didn't argue. "I didn't stop her," he said. "And that's something I'll live with." For the first time in a long while, I saw the man I raised, not the one she molded, but the boy who ran barefoot in this house, climbed the stairs 2 at a time, and hugged me without shame. I saw the guilt in his face. But guilt isn't what I wanted from him. I wanted him to remember. "You're my son," I said, my voice low but steady. "And I love you. But respect is not a gift. It's earned. You let someone disrespect me in this house, the one your mother and I built. That's something no father should have to experience." His eyes glossed over, but he nodded. "I know. And understand this," I continued, leaning forward. "I forgave you the moment you stayed silent that day. But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just means I won't let it eat me alive. He exhaled shakily, like a man who had been holding his breath for months. Then came the question I'd expected. Is there any way to fix this? I didn't give him the comfort of a quick yes. That depends on what you do next. I won't let anyone, your wife or anyone else, take away what your mother and I built. Not now. Not ever. He swallowed hard and nodded again, his jaw tight. I could see him processing it, the weight of his own choices settling where they should have from the start. We didn't hug. Not that day. But as he left the house, I saw something in his walk I hadn't seen in years: humility. He walked like a man who finally understood what lines should never be crossed. As for her, she stayed away. No calls. No messages. Nothing. She was loud when she thought she'd won, but silent when the truth proved louder than her arrogance. That suited me just fine. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about my son finally facing the mirror I'd held up in front of him. And whether he liked it or not, what he saw changed him. I didn't need revenge to destroy her pride. I only needed the truth. And the truth had already done its work. Weeks passed after the confrontation, and the house slowly returned to the rhythm it had always known. Early morning light spilling gently through the long, cream curtains. The soft hum of the garden fountain out back. The faint scent of roses drifting in through the open windows. The villa was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of peace. Of something reclaimed. Every corner of this house felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight that had been sitting heavy on its walls was finally gone. No more whispers of being too old. No more arrogant footsteps treating this place like a prize to be claimed. This villa was mine. It had always been mine. And now, no one dared question that again. I began spending more time in my late wife's garden. That was where everything started all those years ago, with our hands in the soil, planting the first rose bush before the villa was even built. She used to say, a home isn't measured by how many people live in it, but by how much love it holds. And she was right. This house had held a lifetime of love. That's why it hurt so deeply when someone tried to take it from me. Because it wasn't about the walls. It was about the history. My son visited more often now. Always alone. There was no entitled voice echoing behind him anymore. At first, he spoke carefully, like a man stepping through broken glass. But over time, the distance between us began to close. Slowly. He started sitting with me on the veranda again. We didn't always talk about what happened. We didn't need to. Some wounds don't need endless words. Just quiet and presence. One afternoon, he asked me softly, "Dad, why didn't you just sell the house years ago and make your life easier?" I looked at him and smiled faintly. Because some things aren't meant to be sold, son. They're meant to be protected. That was the difference between me and his wife. She saw this villa as real estate. I saw it as a promise, the one I made to his mother on the day we laid the last brick together. I told her this house would never fall into the wrong hands. And I keep my promises. The world around us is changing. People are quick to forget what came before them. They look at an old man and see weakness. They look at an old house and see profit. But they don't see the hands that built the walls. They don't see the lives molded inside those walls. That was her mistake. She saw me as a man past his time. She thought she could erase me quietly, like a signature on a blank page. But what she didn't understand is this: you cannot erase a foundation that was built to last. That day, when she walked out of this house humiliated, she didn't just lose a fight. She lost a war she never truly understood. And my son? He learned something that day too. He learned that blood alone doesn't define family. Loyalty does. Respect does. And if you stand by silently while someone disrespects your roots, then you're as guilty as the one holding the knife. It's strange, really. When people hear the word revenge, they imagine loud battles, shouting, chaos. But true revenge, the kind that lasts, doesn't always look like war. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it's a man sitting calmly in his chair, letting the weight of the truth crush arrogance on its own. I didn't throw anyone out of my house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. All I did was remind them where they stood. And that was enough. One evening, as the sun was setting and the golden light stretched across the villa's veranda, I walked through the house slowly. My fingers trailed along the walls. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, "You're too old for this villa." But she was wrong. I wasn't too old. I was exactly old enough to know what it meant to fight for what matters. Old enough to understand the difference between noise and power. Old enough to choose silence that roars louder than arrogance. I stopped at the front door, looking out over the garden. The same rose bushes bloomed, just as they had the day I planted them with my wife. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle deep inside me. Peace. Not the fragile kind that breaks with the next argument, but the kind that comes from standing your ground. I know not everyone will understand what this villa means to me. Some people will always see old houses as nothing more than property. But if you've ever built something with your own hands, if you've ever poured your life into something, or someone, or somewhere, then you know. You know why I couldn't just let it go. She wanted me to be quiet and leave. Instead, I stayed silent, and made the ground beneath her shift. She underestimated an old man. She underestimated history. She underestimated legacy. She won't make that mistake again. If you've listened to me this far, let me leave you with this. Never let anyone make you feel small in the place you built with your own hands. Never let anyone treat your history like it's disposable. Because respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you command by standing firm in who you are. And if someone tries to take away what matters most to you, don't rush. Don't shout. Don't break. Build your silence into a wall they can't climb. If you enjoy powerful, emotional stories like this one, stories about loyalty, justice, and the quiet strength that lives inside us, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just a story. It's a reminder. And this is exactly how it happened.